Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is Sunday, August 12th, 2018. And the topic tonight is breach of social media contract. We're going to be talking about a different angle on this free speech and deplatforming of certain accounts on social media platforms. Remember, we do this podcast each and every night at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on YouTube. It's also available after the fact on an upload almost immediately after the live stream ends on YouTube, and then it gets uploaded to BitChute, Minds.com, Steemit, Facebook, Google+, Gab, and Twitter. So if you're not following Smaulgld on those accounts, please consider doing so. Just briefly, before we get into our topic, the gold and silver markets are now open again, and they're flat. Gold 12.12, basically flat from its close on Friday, and silver is flat at 15.28 from its close on Friday as well. Bitcoin is at 63.50, and that's a bit down on the day, although yesterday all the cryptocurrencies went up a bit. Ethereum at 320, down a little bit today, but it's off its lows. Bitcoin Cash at 571. Up slightly, and Litecoin had a better day than the other cryptocurrencies. It had been down as low as 55. It is at about 59.25. But let's get into this breach of social media contract. Now, as Smaulgld listeners know, I generally, if there's 2 points of view, I look at both sides and I either pick one, or I realize I don't like either side and I create a third. Now, there's the evidence of that. Well, when I look at what people say about Bitcoin, there's generally two sides. There's the Bitcoin fanatics that say Bitcoin's going to end central banking. It's going to clear the way to a new world where everyone is their own central bank. And we have debt-free money and deflationary currency and so on. And then there's the other side that says, no way, Bitcoin's going to get shut down. It's going to get banned. They're going to arrest everyone for money laundering and make criminals out of everyone. Now, I don't believe in either of those sides, and as you know, I generally take the view that I believe that it's not going to get banned and that the governments, at least in the United States, are going to do what they can to try to cut out, obviously, bad actors, but not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And also, if they do realize there might be a threat to central banks and other powerful interests, they'll probably try to co-opt the whole thing, corral it into a regulatory structure so that it never becomes a big enough threat on the one side so that they have to worry about it. And then if they need to worry about it, they could still have resources to go after the money laundering and the bad acting. But by doing this, they serve two purposes. They make their money, they get their regulation, they get their tracking, they get their taxing, and they avoid the threat of an alternative ecosystem actually replacing the current one. Now, with respect to this, what's happening with deplatforming of certain social media personalities? A lot of people want something to be done. So there's two sides to this. The people that are cheering on the censorship, they're using the argument, I would argue somewhat disingenuously, well, they're a private company, they can do what they want. The reason I say somewhat disingenuously is that the same people generally on the left that are arguing for property rights are the ones who say that a private company, a baker, can't discriminate against somebody who wants a cake baked. Obviously, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in which, quote, property owners who owned lunch counters weren't able to say, well, it's private property, we can do what we want. There's a long-standing history in law now that there are quasi-public places, or even public places by their nature, if they're open to the public in general, or if the government has helped them in any way, that you can't just say, it's my property, I'm going to do what I want. That's long-standing in the United States. In fact, there was a segregated community, I think it was before World War II, that was called Chickasaw, and they try to argue that they could have segregation on the basis that it was private property, and the court held no, because you have roads coming into your private property, and there's other nexuses with the government, which makes your property quasi-private, quasi-public, and therefore it is government action, and if you're discriminating, we can claim it's not private property, you could do what you want. It becomes partially under the purview of the government. So clearly there's an argument to make that the private property argument isn't going to fly, because the large social media companies are in a sense quasi-public. They're generally open to everyone. The size of them indicates they're not small. They are in a sense a public square for the exchange of ideas, even though they are private property. So there are those who say, well, why don't we go after these companies and force them the same way we force other private property, people who are arguing that they have private property, not to be subject to openness, and the courts have said no. You have to open it. You have to bake the cake. You have to serve anyone who shows up. And essentially, that's the argument that many are making against the Facebook, Twitter, or private companies. They want the argument to be made that no, you're not, and therefore you need to be subject to stricter scrutiny. You're a quasi-public place, if not a public place. There's a nexus to government, indeed, and therefore you can't discriminate against users. However, then you get into the whole free speech argument and what a government can allow, because free speech, just like any of the First Amendment, Second Amendment, all the rights that one has pursuant to the Bill of Rights are always limited, according to the courts, by if there's a compelling governmental objective. And if there is, they can limit those rights. And the classic example is in the freedom of speech, that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire, even though you have the freedom of speech, because there's a compelling state interest to stop people from causing a stampede and also causing the people to lose their money because they have to leave the movie theater. So both of those arguments, I don't really like those arguments. And I think that's where they're headed, that they're going to try to defend Facebook and Twitter and YouTube on the basis that they're private and they can do what they want. I would think that if you do argue against that, you probably would win. I think you can win on the basis that you're not. You're large, you're monopolistic, and therefore you have to have open access. Now the problem with that, though, is it does require the government to come in and monitor and regulate to make sure that these companies are actually doing what they say they're doing. The problem when you have the government doing that is, will they actually do it? How are you going to... It becomes a regulatory nightmare, because obviously they're still going to want to boot people off the platform for certain things. And a lot of the reason that there's an issue with all of this is if you take a look at the terms and service, they are nebulous. And I don't think you want the government constantly monitoring, because this in a sense would now be a government sanctioned, if indeed the people that want these things to be regulated as public utilities, well then you're going to be subject to rules and regulations, and the government itself can put in rules and regulations that indeed could challenge your free speech. And then you'd have to say, well, wait a minute, that violates the First Amendment. And I think it'd get very, very unwieldy, because if the government happens to be on the side of restricting what they call hate speech, now I know there's a Supreme Court case against it, but that can be overruled. You just don't want the government, I think, you don't want the government monitoring free speech or somehow guaranteeing it by regulating a platform. It's different when the courts regulate cases, but what these people are arguing when they want the government to step in and slap on a government utility label is basically government ownership over the internet. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not in favor of something being done. Here's my idea, and I think this is a better idea for keeping the large social media platforms in line. I've taken a look at the terms of service. I believe that there is a implied in law contract between the users of Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube and those entities. And why do I say that? Okay, so if you go to a park and there's a sign up and it says, here's what you can and cannot do in the park. You can't bring a dog, you can't smoke, you can't build fires. Okay. And if the park has an admission fee, it has an admission fee, or let's say it's a public park and it doesn't have an admission fee, you're bound by those terms of services. Why? They're actually providing you with a service. You're not doing anything for them. Your presence there doesn't help the park. Arguably, it hurts the park. You're stomping around on the park. You're actually wearing the park out. Same thing with a public library. You go into the library. They tell you what you can and cannot do there. And if you act up, they're going to boot you. And those are the terms of service. Now, the way they've written the terms of services for Facebook and Twitter, as if they're doing you a favor, that they're letting you use their platform, i.e. it's like, well, you can come in here and you can do this, but here's what you can't do. And it's very vague of what you can't do. The difference between you visiting a park and the difference between you visiting the library or other place where you're subject to a terms of service, in those two examples, you don't add any benefit to the park or the library. Library could care less if you're in there. In fact, the more people that end up in the library, the worse off the library is. It's too crowded. Same with the public park. However, Twitter and Facebook need more people to come to their platforms. You're doing them a favor by showing up. Why? The only way, they have nothing to give you other than what everybody else can give you, which is all the other people, content that's there. Remember, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they don't have content. So all the people that show up there, while they're subject to a park-like or a library type terms of service, it's not the same thing. They're actually there, and what they're giving to the platform is the entire value that Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube have, which is not only the content you provide, but all your metadata and your personal data, and that's how they make money. So it is not the same thing as, oh, we'll let you in, you can use the park, but just don't act up in the park. Oh, we'll let you come in and borrow some books, but don't wreck any of the books or we'll have to kick you out. No, they're bringing you in because they make money off of you. Now, I would say when you look at the terms of service, they don't talk about, Twitter mentions the word contract, Facebook does not. But I would say that there's an implied contract for two reasons. First of all, in the case of Alex Jones, he brought people to the platform. He brought so many people to the platform, or if he didn't bring people to the platform, people stayed on the platform because of him. And as a result, these companies made money, irrespective of whether he has monetization on or not. Because if you go to I don't know if Alex Jones uses, or InfoWars uses any of the ad services like Google AdSense. But even if he doesn't, people will leave Alex Jones and go somewhere else, and inevitably they'll end up on a channel and there'll be AdSense and Google will make money. So there's an implied contract. And why? Because kicking off Alex Jones or anybody, especially over a period of time, makes the platform unjustly enriched. Because but for people being on the platform, especially people and channels that have large numbers of people on the platform, they actually have contributed to the economic success in many ways. Not just the content, but the people being there, then their ability to mine the data, the metadata, the personal data, to sell that data, and so on. And to sell Wall Street their data because they have so many users. So clearly, it's not just, oh, we let him in and then he acted up and he didn't provide us any benefit. No, that's not the same thing as visiting a park and you going in and damaging the park and they got to throw you out. You're actually there not just for your own benefit, you're there for their benefit. And that to me implies a contract in which these social media platforms are unjustly enriched. And that's the case where I think that someone who's been booted from the platform can argue for restitution. Now, think of it this way. If it's not just Alex Jones, if they have to start providing restitution to all the people they've booted off, well, that's going to hit them on Wall Street. That's going to hit them on their, that's going to hit them in their financials. Because if the argument is made that they don't have a business without the content providers, they don't have a business, i.e. with the Facebook users, the Google users, the YouTube users, then their whole business is gone. And essentially, they'd have to make payouts to everybody who's been booted off the platform. And also, the other part about, if you look at this from the point of view of a contract, you have to say that there was a breach of contract. Why? Because they booted you off the platform. In most cases, because they haven't even told you what you did wrong. Many people have been booted off of YouTube. They just cite community guidelines, but they don't cite specifically. So they've basically breached the contract, thrown you off. And in addition to their being unjustly enriched, there's also not just a contract for that reason. There's a contract because Reliance was formed on the basis that you were putting your content up there not just for your benefit, but for their benefit alone, and they one-sided breached the contract by booting you off. Now, to get it even more into contract, and why it's even worse, is all the companies that booted off Alex Jones did so in concert. So they were all tortiously interfering with the contracts that each of the content providers had with Alex Jones. So when Apple agrees, yeah, we're going to boot off Alex Jones, and Facebook says, well, I'll boot him off if you boot him off, and then YouTube says, well, we'll do it if you do it. They're now conspiring to break contracts with Alex Jones. And again, the way I come to the idea of the contract, there's an implied contract. There's benefit going in both directions. Again, it's not like you show up at a park and they tell you certain things you can or cannot do, otherwise you got to leave the park. You leave the park doesn't know you jack. You smoked at the park. You brought dogs to the park. You did something you weren't supposed to do that was prohibited. And you clearly can be found to have done it. But if you bring your content and you bring followers, you're enriching the content platform. And it's unjust enrichment for them to take your content, encourage you to go on the platform and provide the content, encourage people to subscribe, which means now they can send out notifications. They can bring people back to the platform because you have created a big channel. So this is not the same thing as, well, you breached the terms of service and it's nebulous. It's far worse than that. There's an implied contract in my view. There's reliance formed, and there's unjust enrichment on the part of the content platforms, the social media platforms, for which I think they owe restitution. And then I also think there's a conspiracy to commit tortious interference with the contracts of content providers they don't like. Now, the other thing you can say is, well, what about the terms of service? Well, the terms of service in a way are almost a contract of adhesion, because if you want to join the public square, it's almost like you have to agree to those terms. You can't negotiate the terms with Facebook. You can't negotiate your entree onto Twitter, onto YouTube. You basically have to accept them as they are. And generally, when you have a contract of adhesion, that type of contract, it's generally not even enforceable. So in this case, it's almost like what's done, i.e. the provision of the service and then the posting of the content, becomes the contract under which both parties have an implied understanding that they will both benefit from this relationship. Again, it's not like going to the library. The only person benefiting from going to the library is you. The library is not interested that you're there. It doesn't matter that you're there. They just want you to behave while you're there, because you don't add anything to the library. You're not bringing books with you. You're not doing storytelling when you're there. You're not adding any content to the library. You're just showing up to the library. And if you act up at the library, they can throw you out and they don't owe you a thing. Same with going to a park and not abiding by the terms of services. So again, when you're at a social media platform, they're not doing you a favor. You are providing them with money, no matter how small or large you are. And the larger you are with a following, the more you're providing them with content, with users, with data, with a whole bunch of stuff that actually creates their entire business model. So without the content providers, which could be anybody, people on Twitter are content providers. We're not just talking about people who create long videos like this one. We're talking about people who just post stuff, tweet stuff, update their status on Facebook. They're contributing to the social media platform in a way in which the social media platform makes money. And so that's why I think that the better way of going about this is that the contracts have been breached. And now, if the content providers want to change their concepts, well, then you'd have leverage. You can go in and say, I'm not going to post here. And if people decide they're not going to post on a certain platform, well, then the platform doesn't exist. That's what people don't understand. And I heard a debate the other day. They were talking about, well, we need to be on on YouTube because everyone else is on YouTube. Well, that's circular. If everyone else wasn't on YouTube, then you wouldn't have to be on YouTube. And the easiest way for that to happen is you get off YouTube and everybody else gets off YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. But what I would argue is, but I understand what people are saying. They don't want to give up what they have built there. And that's the key. If you've built something on these platforms, then there's a contract. You have given, otherwise you've just given all your labor to YouTube for nothing. And so that's why I argue, again, for those people who are joining us late, that there is an implied contract at law under which YouTube or Twitter or Facebook was unjustly enriched by your presence, by you bringing people onto the site, by you bringing people who will subscribe to your channel so that they can have contact with those people, so they can mine their metadata, their personal data, they can sell it to advertisers, they can advertise to Wall Street why they have this many users. That's not because of anything they did. It's because of what the content providers did. And therefore, the content provider is unjustly enriched. You relied on the implied contract by continuing to post there. And when they boot you off, not only did they breach the contract, they breached the contract without cause. Now, generally, you don't get punitive damages in contracts. However, if they have tossed you out without cause, without notice, I think that's a problem. And I think that's the line of reasoning that they should take on this the social media deplatforming, rather than trying to force because remember, if they do force Twitter, Facebook, or the rest of them to become regulated public utilities, now the government's involved in that. And again, if you get a government, a left-wing government, a right-wing government, they can start to play favorites themselves over the platforms. So let's say all these people who want let's say they want all of these, the right wing wants the government to step in and make Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, have them on. But what if the government is left wing and they just interpret, well, we'll let you on, but here are the rules. And you breach the rules. Well, now it's worse than just Facebook telling you to go pound sand. It's the law telling you to go pound sand. You're off, you're off, you're off. They said so. Why? The government said so, or the Supreme Court said so. So I think if you attack this thing from a contract perspective, you're on much more solid grounds. And it actually allows for people to move from platform to platform. And it also will make Apple, Facebook, Google think twice before they deplatform people en masse, or even a large provider, because they might be responsible for damages. And I could argue, if I was a litigator, which I'm not, and I'm not an attorney either, but I would argue that Alex Jones would have damages, and there could be a way of calculating the damages, the amount of videos he put up, the amount of time that people have spent on the platform, the amount of data that was mined, the amount of ads that were produced, just a total number of different ways you can calculate how much value he added to the platform. Now, people say, he didn't add any value to the platform, all he did was say a lot of nonsense. Yeah, but nonsense is monetizable. Nonsense or non-nonsense, just eyeballs are monetizable. Knowing who these people are who watch Alex Jones has enormous value, political value, which, as we saw, Cambridge Analytica was willing to pay for. If you know that Alex Jones fans vote for Donald Trump 78% of the time, that's valuable. And if you know exactly who they are, and you know which ones not only watch, but how much they watch, and how many are actually subscribed, how many respond to the alerts, that's just a political value. But then you could just take those metrics and apply them across the board into dollars. What do they do? How much time do they spend on the platform? Which ads do they like? So Alex Jones, irrespective of the quality of his content, it has brought to all of the platforms that he's been on, and this applies to any content provider, brings to the platform value. And I don't mean value in the sense that the content is valuable. It's the idea that he brings people and keeps people on the site. And that's all these platforms have. That's their entire business model. So when they boot you off the site, again, I say they have breached the contract, and I think they owe restitution. Well, let me know what you think. Let That's tonight's topic. I really think that that is the better line of attack, because I think it would cause the social media platforms to be, first of all, not only not to do it, and if they are going to do it, be prepared to pay, but to conspire the way they did, to sit around, because that is tortious interference with contract. You go to Apple goes to Facebook, or Facebook goes to Apple, hey, let's kick off Alex Jones. Well, if there's an implied contract and there's value there and there's restitution to be paid, they're both egging each other on to destroy the value of the contract that Alex Jones has with those platforms. All right, let's take a look here. What we have, PAD, Bitcoin was created to fund, I'm not going to get into that tonight. During the bankruptcy under Roosevelt, all private property, anything that gets taxed as property, was pledged by the state as collateral to the Federal Reserve. I'm not going to get into that tonight either. ASMR people, I want to stick to the topic here. Okay, let's see. Poppy stuff. Followers of AJ are taking their business to other platforms. Well, that's fine, and that's actually what they should do, and I would prefer to see people do that rather than to force YouTube, force Twitter, force Apple to accept his content. I do take the view, even though there's legal precedent that you don't have to take the view, that if you want to use the private property argument, I think you should be allowed to use it. But the courts do say that private property is no longer absolute if you have some nexus to the government, it's quasi-public or is public, and therefore the Bill of Rights does apply. So I don't like to make that argument. I think that's because then you have the government in charge of saying, okay, you guys are now utilities and you now shall be regulated by us. But who's us? Us depends on who the people are. Just like when you have a Department of Justice that's Democrat, they're going to go against the Republicans. Well, if you have whatever agency that's going to monitor Facebook, Google, YouTube,